All right, welcome folks. We're on a pretty tight timeline today, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome to Demystifying Grad School, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kaylena Ryan. I come from the Secwepemc Gitxsan and Tsimshian Nations. I am the Associate Director of the Indigenous Student Center, and I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that at Simon Fraser University, across our 3 campuses, we live on the unceded, traditional, and occupied territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Coquitlam, Katzie, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, Kakite, Tsawwassen, and other Coast Salish peoples. I encourage you to share in the chat what traditional land you're currently occupying in this moment as well. I'd also like to let you folks know that this event will be recorded for folks who have to leave early. And I'm very excited for 3 amazing and brilliant panelists to introduce themselves and share their knowledge and experiences with you today. If you have any questions during this event, please share them in the chat. You can send messages to either the hosts and panelists or to everyone in attendance. And there will be time at the end of the presentations for our panelists to answer as much questions as they can before we close at 2 p.m. today. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first panelist to introduce herself. Please welcome Jessica La Rochelle.
Kaylena. Acewell tlachutni telsqueet talitza quest alis, sel stalo casta Okanagan, casta Trinidad, shwa Squamish off Tamuk, sel Sisala, Siam Talat casta Sulemontuch, Atos Skolwell calls Quetzlala. I'm Skomia. My name is Jessica La Rochelle. Skomia is a name that I share with my mother, and it refers to a set of mountains near our home territory known as the Three Sisters. And my mother is the 3rd sister in her family, and that name was given to her by her grandpa. And it was passed along to me by her and my grandparents when our family was all given our names a few years ago. So I'm very humbled to be able to share that name with her. And it always reminds me and connects me and grounds me to my family and to my mom and to my home territory. And I am also Okanagan on my grandmother's side from the Marchand family. Most of my family currently lives in Salmon River and Vernon and some in West Bank. And I'm also Trinidadian. My dad was born in Trinidad, Port of Spain, and the family emigrated to Canada when he was 10. Yeah, so that's a bit about me, and I'll go into more when we go through our presentations, but I'm very grateful to be here today. I'm joining you from my home in North Vancouver on Squamish territory, and I'm very excited to be here today. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. Ashley, please introduce yourself.
Tanshi Kioao, Ashley Edwards, Dishna Karshan, and Machif P. Dutch, P. Scottish Nia, Chilliwack, Oceania, Maka, Burnaby, Ni Weekend. So hello everyone, welcome. My name is Ashley Edwards. I'm Métis and Dutch on my father's side, and I'm a citizen of Métis Nation, BC. His family comes from the Red River area of Manitoba, specifically St. Francis Xavier and Portage la Prairie, where most of his family still reside. And his father, my paternal grandfather, grew up in occupied Holland and immigrated in the early 1950s for work, which is how he met my grandmother. And my mom's side is Scottish. They settled primarily in Nova Scotia with a little bit in Ontario, and they're from both the Highlands and the lowlands of Scotland. So it's an interesting mix. I grew up in Chilliwack, which is Stalo territory, and so I feel a deep connection to the landscape there. And it was my time working with Stelo Nation as their assistant librarian that has led me on my current path. And so I've never been to my Métis homeland. Maybe one day when COVID finally lets us travel safely, I'll be able to go there. But I like to honor and recognize the territory that has influenced who I am today, which is the Stelo territory.
Thank you, Ashley. Dorothy, and then once you're done introducing yourself, Dorothy, please feel free to start your presentation.
Okay, white everyone, and I'm grateful that Kaylena acknowledged all of my Coast Salish relatives. I call all of the Coast Salish nations my cousins because I discovered that our languages are actually related on some level. I had a linguist tell me that. So just to begin, I'm going to introduce myself in a cultural way. My Secwepemc name is Huchla, which is the name that I use here at the Burnaby campus, which is where I am zooming in from. And I also have Scale, Chinese, and Scottish in my genealogy. So I always forget to include the Chinese and the Scottish for some reason, because I was brought up within the Secwepemc and Scale cultures. So I tend to emphasize those because they're the cultures that influenced me growing up. And I carry 3 names from the land. I always say that, and I introduced Huchla. That's my Secwepemc name. I also have Okanagan name, Syilx name, and that is Quashke. And when I lived on the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee in Ontario, I was adopted into a clan and given a name out there as well. So I am blessed with all these names, and they're all bird names. So I'm always flying around. And each name that was given to me was also, they gave me a teaching and a responsibility that I had to each one of those names. So I need to uphold those responsibilities every year. So the rest of me is, in terms of cultural, I am the eldest of 10. I have 1 daughter. I have over 65 nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews. And as of last month, I had got my 2nd great niece. So I'm really blessed with lots of young people in my life at home. And I was brought up on the Splatcheen community, which is one of the 17 villages or communities of the Secwepemc Nation. And we have the largest land base in British Columbia, what is known as British Columbia. And I was raised the first few years of my life by my grandparents, who never went to residential school and never attended any white man's education system. And so I really am grateful that I had that influence by my grandparents and great aunties and uncles at the time that I was growing up. However, that doesn't mean that my family wasn't affected, because my mom and her siblings went to residential school. And my siblings and myself were part of the 60s scoop. So we were taken away from our families and put into white foster homes. So that's part of that's my cultural history. Professionally, I worked in the film and television industry before coming to grad school. And I traveled all over Turtle Island and into Mexico to bring visual stories to the national screen culture here in Canada. And I'm recognized as a professional visual artist, video artist in this country by Canada Council. My academic genealogy started at the University of Toronto, which is where I got my bachelor, my BA. And that's where I started comparing Indigenous thought with Western thought. And of course, I couldn't talk about it that way back then because Indigenous knowledge did not have an effect or wasn't recognized back then. So I went out into the working world for a number of years, and I came here to SFU to do my master's at the School of Communications, and then I continued on to do my PhD at UBC in Educational Studies. So all of my academic work has been looking at how Indigenous knowledge affects and influences everything that we do. So that's my introduction, and I may have gone over my 5 minutes. So I will now share my screen just to, it's just one page, and why can't I find it? Oh, Sarah, can you share the one that I sent you, please? And I would just like to also give thanks to Stevie and Sarah, who are behind the scenes here, supporting us in a technical way. And they're here at GPS and great colleagues to work with. So I just want to talk a little bit about my experiences in my MA and PhD committees. And I want to talk a little bit about indigenizing defenses and writing, indigenized writing, and talk about that in terms of how my experience of that. So everything is always about story with me. And in my master's and my PhD, I, like everyone else, was assigned a supervisor when I came in to both those programs. But after the first year, I could see that the composition of my committee was not going to work. So I ended up firing the ones that were assigned to me. And I had made relationships with other faculty members who I approached and asked if I could have them on my committee. And I'd really like to encourage people who are applying to grad school to think about really doing research on the faculty members within the department that you're going into, because that really makes a difference. And what I did with my MA program, I actually did that, and I went and met with a few of them just to get more of a personal feel of how they were. And being an Indigenous person, it was very important for me to have a supervisor who was conscious of colonization. And that was what happened in my MA program, was that the initial faculty member who was assigned to me was not very conscious about race politics and or colonization. So I ended up wasting a whole year of my program. I think I could have got out of that program in 3 years if I had been on it and had the support of a focused faculty member. So I ended up losing 1 whole year because of that. So I'd just like to recommend to people that you do that. You know, it's like research the faculty members in the department that you're wanting to go into. And you have every right to do that, because my whole approach in grad school is that these are my programs and I'm the one that's going to be driving the trajectory of my program. And I'll tell you a story about my PhD committee at UBC. And I mean, the first year ended up being pretty tumultuous because I was assigned 2 co-supervisors, and one of them wasn't really involved or engaged. He didn't respond to emails and that kind of thing. And the gal who was taking action was herself in going through personal things in terms of her health, but just her manner of working was also really problematic to me. You know, for instance, you know, it would take 12 or more emails to set up a time to meet. And then I would show up at the place that was designated and then find out that she had changed it at the last minute and forgot to tell me. So, and that really annoyed me because I live in East Van and it takes me 45 minutes to drive all the way to UBC. So I ended up asking her to step aside. And on the day that I had set up this meeting, it was really tense, right? I mean, so I had talked to a mentor friend, and she had suggested that I engage some of our Indigenous ways of doing. So what I did was I came into that meeting with the 2 supervisors, the outgoing one and the incoming one, and I came there prepared to engage in an Indigenous way. And when I walked into that meeting, the current supervisor started attacking me verbally and talking about how I had disrespected her. And I had to really collect myself and just say, just a moment, before we go there, can I just give you this gift to say thank you for helping me get the shirt grant for my PhD program, which was true because she had set aside 3 or 4 hours and we sat and just hammered out my shirk application. And she knew the language of the tri-agencies really well and helped me to put together a really sound program, or, you know, like grant application. And then I presented a gift to the new supervisor just to acknowledge that we were starting a journey together. But the best part about this story was after I finished that meeting, and it was so incredibly tense, and I walked into the washroom and I looked at myself in the mirror and I had my dress on inside out and backwards. The label for my dress was like right here, my throat. And I stood there and I just laughed and laughed and laughed at myself. And I just thought, my ancestors are telling me not to take any of this seriously or any of it personally, you know, because I was killing myself laughing that I had walked right across campus dressed like that. And it just, yeah. I mean, I look back on it now and I still laugh. So it's like the message I'm trying to get across is take ownership of your programs. The program is yours. You decide what you want. And because so often I've seen in both my MA and PhD cohorts where faculty members were shaping the research for their own benefit rather than the graduate student, you know, so I think we need to be aware of that. So the second point is about indigenizing defenses, and I'll just tell you stories. In my both my MA and PhD, I wrote in a very outside of the conventional way of writing in academia. When I got my first draft of my MA completed, I met with my committee and I told them that I was going to quit grad school because I had to ask myself, could I stand up in global Indigenous country and be proud that I had my name on this document? And the answer was no, because not to offend anyone, but I felt like it read like I was an uptight white woman scholar. And so when I met with my committee, they said, Dorothy, you're a storyteller. And underneath all of this, I can feel the stories, but they're not coming through. So after that, I gave myself permission to write from an Indigenous perspective. And I ended up writing in 4 voices, both in my master's and my PhD. In my PhD, I stated that I was privileging Indigenous knowledge. So it was clearly laid out in terms of my methodology and every aspect of my PhD dissertation, privileged Indigenous knowledge. You know, so just to be aware that you can do that, right? And you can do it from your own cultural perspective. And just the last piece that I wanted to talk about is just how important it is to read the graduate handbook when you're first coming in, because I know that I didn't do that and I ended up being scattered. I didn't understand about deadlines, like all those things. It's like the graduate handbook, and I'm designing an Indigenous one for SFU, but it lays out all the administrative deadlines that you need to meet and all of that. So I think I've used up my 15 minutes. Kaylena, I don't know. Have I?
We
I'm
we
done.
ended our introductions a bit early, so feel free to take a couple more minutes if you'd like, Dorothy.
Oh, okay. I really can't. I mean, when I talked about indigenizing my defenses, in my master's, what I did was I approached an elder from Squamish to ask him to be at my defense so that he could witness what I did and what I was talking about. And I had met with him a few times to explain the work that I was doing in terms of visual storytelling. And I did that, and I did it in a way, I presented him with a gift and with tobacco, just because the way that I was thinking about it was, in case anyone from my territory questioned what I was doing here, then they could come and see Sam George and he could explain to them what I had done on their territory. Because that was one of the first things I did when I first moved here, was to go and introduce myself to elders in each one of our host communities, at least the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish. And also what I did at my MA in terms of indigenizing it was I gave gifts to everyone once I found out that I had passed. My family had come down from the interior, some of them, and they were there witnessing, and they helped me do the giveaway. And we also hosted what I call an urban feast, and we invited specific people. So yeah, and I also did that for my PhD. It was the PhD was held in the Tsleil-Waututh Hall at UBC, and I had numerous friends and family come to witness my defense. And as soon as I finished my defense and I found out that I had passed, my family was there and they started drumming and singing, and they did the Secwepemc honor song and came and wrapped me in a blanket and gave me an eagle feather and some tobacco. And there again, my daughter and I hosted a urban feast for close friends and family who had supported me throughout that whole process. So that's what I mean when I talk about indigenizing my defenses or my dissertations. So be creative. It's like you can do it in what feels right to you. So that's it. All my relations, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I really like what you said when you said take ownership of your programs and that they're yours. That's really powerful. For those that join late, feel free to enter questions in the chat. You can either send it to myself or to everyone that's in attendance today. And the event is being recorded if you need to leave early. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Ashley Edwards. Take it away, Ashley.
Yeah, Marcy, Kaylena. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, there we go. It's just a few points that I want to highlight for graduate students. I want to start a little bit about how I got into libraries. So I'm the Indigenous Initiatives and Instruction Librarian based out of the Burnaby campus, or my home, depending on the day right now. And I kind of fell into librarianship, and it has, the story has to do with why I'm in Indigenous librarianship and why I'm really happy to be here with you today. So I'm first generation university student within my family. My dad didn't finish high school. My mom married him and had me instead of going to university. And two of my siblings, I'm the oldest of four, and two of them didn't finish high school either, although one did go back and get her GED. And out of the four of us, I'm the only academically inclined one. My brothers are both in trades and my sister is very artistic. And this has influenced how I approach my work and how I approach helping students and recognizing the different ways of knowing and being in this world of academia that often privileges one specific way of learning or one specific way of expressing your learning. So I find this really important to foreground what I'm talking about. And the other important piece that I bring to my work as a Métis woman is the lateral racism and violence that I faced growing up, specifically around being told that I didn't count because I was non-status. And there's a lot more to it like that. But not being quote unquote dark enough or not white enough to kind of fit in either world where I was growing up had a really deep impact on me and how I approached education and myself in the world that I'm still working on packing now. And I think it's going to be a long adventure. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I started working in libraries with Stella Nation in their the Stella Research and Resource Management Center, and I was the assistant librarian there, where we supported communities and we supported the other departments within Stella Nation on their research activities, primarily around treaty and archaeology, which was the two main departments that helped us or that came to us for help. But I also worked really in-depthly with graduate students. Graduate students, which is what really inspired me to move into academic libraries and to look more at research and what research looks like from this Indigenous perspective. In terms of librarianship, my time there is sort of like this, I guess, I don't know how to explain it properly, but it's where I started to really understand the Tatalia Nahani talks about it as colonial conditioning. So I'm borrowing her phrase, and she's from Squamish, around how libraries enforce that, particularly through classification. And so we would, in our collection, we use what we most academic libraries use when I was at Stallo, which was the Library of Congress classification. And for those who aren't aware, about like 90% of what is considered Indigenous topics end up in the history section within Library of Congress. And there are a lot of reasons for that, primarily due to racism in the 1800s when libraries were being established here, and the two white men who wrote the classification systems that we use. And so I was having a really hard time when elders would come in and be looking for information on community, and it's not readily or easily available based on this system, or that everything was in the history section. And so that really shifted, or was maybe the first shift in my worldview and my mindset on how information is organized and how the world is presented and what is left out. And the second one learning there was learning the stories of the land. So I grew up in Chilliwack, and I grew up hiking and camping and with a deep appreciation and love for being outside, but I didn't know the stories of any of the land around me. And so during my 3 years with Stallo, I got to learn just a snippet of the history and the culture that's there. And I can see Jessica looking at me, and I know I'm speaking over her family and I'm very aware of that. But it had a really moving, deep impact with me to this day, where I try to share that with my stepdaughter so that when we drive home to my mom's house in Chilliwack, we can talk about Thieflake, and we can talk about the sign out in Chilliwack saying Ace Whale and what does that mean, and little things like that. So she understands that it's more than this farming town that was settled primarily by Dutch farmers, that there's a richer history there and a richer history around us. And we do the same in the Vancouver area. I just feel such a deep connection to the valley that it really comes out more for me there. So this is where I've been approaching librarianship, about bringing in oral traditions and oral stories into what is a text-based. And it's a bit of a tension sometimes for me, because I love books, and nothing makes me happier or calmer than sitting and reading a really good book. But I realize that not everybody learns that way. And I was introduced to some amazing concepts about education through my BA in adult ed, around how different people learn. And it reminded me so much of my brother who came after me, who was very athletic and always on the move, and he would get into so much trouble in school. And like a lot of elementary schools did at the time, they said, why can't you be more like your sister Ashley? And look at her, she's reading and she's quiet and she's getting good grades. And I think that did a huge disservice to my siblings who came after me, who were learning in different ways and are experts and amazing people. We're just different, and we have different strengths. And so that is what I think about when I work with students. And so where this is leading me, and I should quickly check my time. Where this is leading me is to talk to you a little bit about what the library has to offer you as a graduate student, and specifically as an Indigenous graduate student. So the library has what we call our liaison librarians, and they are subject experts. So I can't remember everybody that was on the call, but if you're in education, there's an education librarian. If you're in health sciences, there's a health sciences librarian, and they know the resources in-depthly that can allowing them the opportunity then to sit with you and share with you their knowledge of the specific databases and where to go for information and lit reviews and all of those pieces that you'll need to do as a graduate student. There's also myself and Jenna Walsh, who's the other Indigenous Initiatives librarian, and we are very happy to sit with you and talk about doing Indigenous research. So things around terminology and the tensions that there are within libraries and terminology, which I'm happy to take questions on later, but I admit it is not nice. And that is a project I'm working on. I was actually at a meeting this morning about some of that. And so we are happy to sit with you there and work with you one-on-one. So email, Zoom, in person, I think is still a little up in the air for some of us, but happy to make whatever will work, basically, to come and help you with your work. And we can help you. So say you're in education and you're looking at researching it from an Indigenous perspective, you can reach out to myself or Jenna, but you could also reach out to the education liaison librarian. I always encourage students to reach out to both at the same time, so that we can collaborate and work with you as a community, as a team, to support your learning and your research. And there are a few things about the library that I want to highlight. specifically right now, I want to mention the Media and Maker Commons. And what I love about this, and it unfortunately opened like the January that COVID hit. So not a lot of people know about it or have been able to take the time to explore it. And I'm bringing it up in this context for you to really showcase that there's podcasting and video studios. And so this will allow people to then express their learning in different ways and hopefully move away from the traditionally written paper and do an oral recording, or bring in someone and do a conversation, or a conversation as part of your assignments, or to prepare a video. They have a lot of other really cool stuff like 3D printing and laser cutters and these things. But those are the two pieces I wanted to highlight, because I think that thinking about what Dorothy was talking about in terms of indigenizing your writing and indigenizing your thesis, those are two aspects that a lot of people maybe overlook about the orality of knowledge and how it can be transferred that way. At the same time, as graduate students, we do have also the Research Commons. We have our locations both at Burnaby and Vancouver, and these are amazing, and they offer writing support and thesis support, and they're developing, or I was asked to make sure everybody knew they're working on supporting other ways of doing theses. So if the template doesn't work for you as an Indigenous student, our thesis assistant can help you to indigenize it and to work with that template in a way that works for you to showcase what it is that you are doing and how you want to present your information. I'm just going to double check my notes to make sure I'm getting my points. They also offer a wide range of workshops on everything, say citation management, writing support. They have a thesis boot camp that's offered a few times a semester or a few times a year, as well as writing groups that are online, data management, in vivo, ArcGIS, all of these sorts of programs. And I'll pop some links into the chat after my turn here so that everybody can easily access them. And so I highly encourage people to take advantage of these. And right now, everything is being done online, just based on COVID. But there is space at least I know for sure at the Burnaby campus for graduate students to go in and book space to sit and work on their research, their writing. The space is dedicated to graduate students. You have to be authenticated to come in with a door code that you access by verifying that you're a grad student. And that is just to make sure the space is dedicated for you, for your work, and support. There's librarians and staff in that space to help you. Let me check. Though the other thing I want to, so research data management. So they offer a lot of workshops and consultations on the planning, the access, and DI description and security, like all of what you need for data management. And they are approaching this through principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and the OCAP. So ownership, control, access, and I forgot what P stands for. It'll come to me, I'm sure. It's just my nerves. But they approach this through the OCAP principles. And so I think it's a really awesome way to get some assistance with that. Let's see, the other big point I want to mention is knowledge mobilization. And this is something that I'm really excited about. Someone who thought they'd go into journalism, but who didn't. So knowledge mobilization is really about getting your information out into the world. And we have an amazing knowledge mobilization officer. Her name's Dr. Lupin Battersby. And she's helped me actually even just this year with some support around sharing out information through the media, which is very nerve-wracking, but she was amazing walking me through it. And so with her support, she can help students plan and edit and go through some steps to share out your information. So she'll run workshops on things like how to write to be published in something like The Conversation, or how to speak to the media on a specific topic. And so it's all about disseminating your research and sharing it out with others in a way that is making you also very comfortable. And I will share out a link. There's a specific network that they shared with me to share with you today around the Indigenous mentorship network of the Pacific Northwest. And there's a Knowledge Mobilization Award right now that is open with a deadline of next month, I think December 3rd. So I'll share that link out with anybody who's interested. And Lupin is happy to chat with people and meet with you around the support that she can offer. And I'm going to bring this back. I'll close it up so that Jessica can come in and share her piece. And I just want to close this up by saying, as a first generation academic and university student, and as somebody who often in a roundabout way maybe felt got excluded from Indigenous spaces on campus, because after my experience in high school, I didn't seek them out in university. I didn't feel comfortable coming to the library for help. I didn't think I'd be allowed there. I thought all my questions were wrong and that I should already know how to do all of these things. And thinking about that, it's also amazing that I ended up working in libraries, but I really like to share this to let students know that you're not alone in feeling like you can't come in and ask for help. And I also don't want you to feel like you can't come in and ask for help. We love helping people. It's why we got into this profession. When we were all in person and I was on the research help desk, I would often tell new students, I don't care if you come in and ask me how to find out if Starbucks is open on campus. Come in and ask your questions and I will help you no matter what. And I'm going to say the same offer here. If you need help with something and you just remember my name or my email that we can share out, please don't hesitate to ask. And if I can't help you, I can figure out who can, which is kind of the magic of libraries, is finding you what you need. And so I realize I've given you a lot of information and I'm super happy to take questions. And I'll share some links out in the chat as Jessica's speaking, and I will turn it over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this comes through. Yeah, if I can go into, there we go. So I introduced myself earlier, and I just wanted to also share those. So those are my grandparents, Siam Talat and Swilnili Moltuch, at my MEd graduation. So I completed my MEd in leadership in Indigenous education, and I was part of the Squamish cohort. And so there were some folks who graduated with me from Squamish Nation, and then some urban Indigenous folks and folks from, I think our cohort was 16 and 15 of us were self-identified, and also a mixture of First Nations and Métis from various regions. And I just wanted to go through, I have quite a few slides, and I'm hoping that I'll get through most of them. There are some that I've kind of saved for the Q&A section, and I'm hoping that will prompt some great discussion. So my approach here is to share a bit about my MEd research, but I also wanted to reflect on the contributions that Indigenous students make to the academy and to the institution. And as you know, as Dorothy was saying, how to make the experience your own and take control. And I also wanted to share about the 4 R's, and that really guides me in my approach to my work, but also it guided my research as well. And then I'll end with some guiding principles in terms of decolonizing, unsettling the settler, and all of those fun things that happen when you're Indigenous in a colonized institution. So I wanted to bring it back to the First Peoples Principles of Learning. For those of you who aren't familiar with these, these were developed in partnership with First Nations Education Steering Committee and educators. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are some things that are really helpful when thinking about how to approach education. And so some of the questions, and often questions I ask when I am, talking to my colleagues is in my role as the director for Indigenous student recruitment and admissions, is I really want to challenge them to rethink and reframe the deficit approach that Indigenous students are placed under. And rather than, saying, oh, well, Indigenous students need a lot of resources, they need a lot of support, they need extra this. What do Indigenous students, how do they enrich the institution? What wealth do they bring? And how are others' experiences impacted for the better in having Indigenous students at our institution? And how do we create those spaces for making and achieving respect for Indigenous knowledges? So I took that from Marie Baptiste when she talks about decolonizing education. And a lot of my work, and I found a lot of the things that I encountered as a grad student, was challenging assumptions. And I'm taking an excerpt from one of my colleagues, Dr. Michelle Pidgeon, and when you're in a classroom or at an event or something, and an Indigenous topic comes up, it's like everybody turns and looks at you to see what your opinion is or what your thoughts are, and they don't want to speak because you're the expert because you're Indigenous. And part of that is it's challenging because you want to feel included and you want to feel seen, but you also don't want that pressure of having to speak for every Indigenous person, because we're diverse, and we need to acknowledge that diversity. And so I touched on a couple of points, and also the thought that when I was new in my role here, I asked about how many Indigenous students were in undergraduate and graduate programs. And I was given a list of, oh, well, here are all of the Indigenous language or Indigenous studies students. And I said, well, are all of these students Indigenous? And, I was answered, well, they're taking Indigenous studies, so they must be. And really just asking questions about how information and what information is gathered to determine where students are. And of course, there are quite a few students in Indigenous studies, but not all Indigenous students are in Indigenous programs. And it's really important not for students to be identified, but to feel safe and feel included and feel like they can connect with resources and spaces that are culturally relevant. And also, thinking about that and for those who are still exploring their identity, or thinking about how they're connected to their culture or community, there are some students who've been displaced and students who aren't connected to their home community and are wanting to find ways to do that. And so we also need to make sure that those students feel safe and included. And as Ashley was talking about, well, like when I grew up on the reserve, and it wasn't until I came to university that my identity was questioned, because growing up on the res, everybody knew who I was. They knew my parents, they knew my grandparents. Nobody ever thought like, oh, here's this little brown girl with curly hair. She, must not be Native, but everybody knew. And it wasn't until I came to university when people are like, well, where are you from? And I thought, here. And they said, no, where are you originally from? I'm like, what do you mean? Like, and then when they found out I was Indigenous, all of a sudden it was like this, oh, wow, that's so great. This is so neat. You're like my Indian princess. And I'm just like, no, thank you, this is not okay. So there's that challenge and that feeling of, I remember calling my gram and saying, like, why are people asking who I am or where I'm originally from? Like, that it's so weird to me that I have to, it's important for me to situate myself, but to have these people come up and say, who are you and why are you here and why are you taking up this space that's, not intended for you. And so it's very challenging. And so I think about that in terms of when students are exploring their identity and wanting to find spaces to connect in how I felt as a student in my undergrad. And so when I eventually did my MEd capstone, it was focusing on the experience of students in NITEP, where I was working at the time, which is the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at UBC. And my capstone involved interviewing current students and alumni, some of whom were current graduate students, and talking about their experiences in post-secondary education and really focusing on the Indigenous, and taking a critical look at the way that historically, and I say historically, but it's ongoing, students are viewed as the problem rather than the paternalistic and racist system in which they're placed. And some of the things that I looked at in my literature review, I looked at the systemic barriers that Indigenous students face broadly, institutional approaches that focus on decolonization, and safe spaces, and then also looked at models of Indigenous education programs that have positive impacts on student learning. And I'm not going to read out some of these quotes, but I just wanted to share them here while I am talking. And some of the things that really stood out for me was the importance of community and relationships and connection for Indigenous students, and that how much the dynamics changed when they're in a cohort and they're in the majority and they're able to connect with their peers without having to explain anything or justify anything, and how that changes when they go into a program or an institution where they're then in the minority and looked at as the expert on all things Indigenous and the pressure that that puts on them. And so, thinking about all of the different hats and all of the different, like I think of code switching for those of you who are having conversations about identity politics, and how many of Indigenous students have to code switch when they go into an Indigenous space versus a non-Indigenous space. One of my favorite quotes that really resonated with me and really impacted my work and how I work with students is, one of the MEd participants shared about the importance of the ability and freedom to explore themselves, and having that acceptance of their peers and the validity of the background where they come from. And so when they have all of those things, that to them defines a safe space and a positive learning space for them. And so I talked a bit about rethinking and reframing. And, for those of you who are thinking about, like, if you're coming from the faculty perspective or the institutional perspective, think about how we can decolonize the academy. So what impact do current policies and procedures have on Indigenous students, and why were they originally created? Because some of the policies and procedures that currently exist are from 10, 20 more years ago and aren't current or reflective of the politics and identities and global things like UNDRIP that exist now. And think about the way that you speak about Indigenous students. thinking about equity deserving, underrepresented, versus systemically excluded, historically silenced. There's that shift, and there's that difference on, having, not being able to participate, being forcibly removed. And when you're thinking about wanting to engage in reconciliation and engage in decolonization work, think about the way that you're asking, what you're asking, and how you're asking Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, Indigenous students to be a part of your processes. Is it to tick a box and say that Indigenous peoples were consulted, or do you want reflective and meaningful representation in your work? Oops, I've touched on the 4 R's a bit, and so I just wanted to put it into a context where I indicate, through that the university needs to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into education, and that in all of my experience, I found that Indigenous students are the ones who feel the most responsible and about being a role model or being a representative of their community, and don't think about their experience and their journey as an individual. They think of themselves as a representative of a community. I've touched on this a little bit, and I think I'll save this slide for some of the Q&A. When I'm thinking about also Indigenous faculty and staff, I also want you to consider relationships to others and behave in ways that build those relationships. And, what my colleagues mentioned, lateral violence and challenging situations, emotional labor that is placed on Indigenous folks. Think about what it means to be successful and understand the importance of place and where you situate yourself, and be willing to level the power relations within. I have the classroom here, but within like all of your interactions. Well, that's it. Tziithamitsil, Yathukwas Hai. I'll turn it back over to Kaylena. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothy, Ashley, and Jessica, for your amazing presentations and sharing your knowledge with everyone here. We have quite a bit of faculty that was interested in this event today. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask you three, and I know Jessica just touched on it a little bit in her presentation, but how can faculty support our Indigenous graduate students, not only professionally and academically, but also personally, to ensure their retention at SFU and success? Maybe we could start with Dorothy.
There is a really good report that is titled Reconciliation in Canadian Indigenous Graduate Education, a report that was done for the Canadian Association of Graduate Studies. And this is a task force with Joanne Archibald, Mavis Reimer, and Melanie Braywith. And they go in depth. They've been doing, this report was released on September the 20th, or September 2020 rather, and they're in the process of updating it right now. I have a copy of it if faculty members want to get a copy, or anyone else. I did a search online, I couldn't find it anywhere, but I have a copy, so if anyone wants it. But the report talks about various things. What is the meaning of reconciliation? How is reconciliation manifested in graduate programs and services? What are the successes, challenges? What are the gaps and the needs? and then they finalize it with their findings and recommendations. So I think faculty would really benefit by reading this report because it goes specifically into, for instance, physical supports, intellectual supports, emotional, spiritual supports, and holistic services and programs, like all those things that directly affect graduate students. So that's a report that I can send anyone who emails me, and I'll just put my email in the chat.
That's great. Thank you, Dorothy. Ashley, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I think, and what Jessica was just talking about relationships. And when I work with faculty on looking at indigenizing and decolonizing their pedagogy and practices, which is something I'm doing through my work at the library, specifically the Indigenous Curriculum Resource Center. And I want to bring it back to that positionality and understanding who you are in that power relationship and what you're bringing to it. And so taking a really reflective or reflexive practice and thinking about why are you in that relationship with that student? What do you bring to it? What do they bring to it? But also recognizing that they are going to have lived experiences that you don't have, possibly don't have, and honoring those and seeing the student as not a student, but also as a person. I think that that's really important. Yeah, I think just really understanding who you are in that relationship is what I would recommend right now.
Thanks, Ashley. Jessica, did you want to extend on anything that you shared?
Sure. I think I want to go back to the slide that I had. Let's see. And I said I would touch on. You're thinking about, when non-Indigenous supervisors or mentors ask about how they can help, acknowledging that it makes sense and it's valid for Indigenous students to have a mistrust of the institution, and thinking about like the ongoing impact of residential schools. I myself am not directly impacted. My grandparents went to day schools, and they share that their experiences were not negative in the same way that others have been, but they don't want that to take away from teaching about residential school and the importance of things coming out of it, and also don't want to detract from the genocide and the atrocities that Indigenous peoples have faced. And so when we're thinking about a lot of things, and for me it always comes down to relationships, and sometimes you want to just hit the ground running and tell the student, okay, these are all the things that you need to do, here's your checklist, here's the way to write a paper, here's this, here's that, but spending that time to build that relationship with the student so they understand your values, your motivations, who you are as a person, and they know that they can trust you when they don't feel that they can trust the institution. That is really important, and something that I strive to do for all of the students that I work with.
Thank you so much. Another question that I think is really important for this event today, and it's a fairly simple question, but something that I feel like can be expanded on with each of the departments that you work in, is what resources are available to current Indigenous graduate students. And I know that Ashley, you touched on this a bit. So Dorothy, do you want to share within your GPS department, what can you offer for our grad students?
Well, there are a number of things. I actually just have got two lists here of student awards and Indigenous specific scholarships. But of course, everyone knows about the tri-agency grants for SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR. But we have entrance scholarships here at Grad Studies. And we also have scholarships that some private donors have made towards those entrance scholarships. And I'm not sure if this still exists, but when I was in both my MA and PhD, New Relationship Trust supported BC Indigenous grad students. And with a really good scholarship, I think you are allowed to apply for up to 20,000 per degree. And those were really useful and came in very handy. And of course, other Indigenous organizations like Indispire, which is located in Ontario, but you can also check the Assembly of First Nations. I know I got a scholarship from them, but I also got a scholarship from my own band, like the business end of my band, because they put up a scholarship for students in post-secondary. So check your local and regional organizations and your bands. And also to be aware that your supervisor from your committee should probably have access as well. You know, I mean, and that's where it's really good to really look at the composition of your committee in terms of what skills do they bring to your committee. You know, so one of them should have that as a skill, right? In terms of finding financial aids or scholarships for you. And the other thing that the gals here in the GPS office asked me to mention is that we have travel awards here for Indigenous grad students. And with COVID, it's like the so-called criteria for that is kind of fluid and flexible. So you can check in with us more about that. And there was one that Rachel mentioned on one of these documents, which is actually for an undergrad student. So I would think this would be, it's called Undergraduate Student Research Award, and it's administered through this office, and it provides opportunities for students to be part of a major graduate level research project while being supervised by a university prof. And it's a great way for undergraduate students to experience grad school research for a term. So there's full-time and part-time awards are available for that particular program. So that's really good for undergrads who are thinking about going into grad school, you know, if they want to experience that level of research. So it's just to know about that, right? And I mean, I've got a whole list here of funding opportunities. I'll send them out to all of you, Ashley, Kaylena, and Jessica, you know, just so that you also have them, you know, for information to give out in case people ask.
Thanks, Dorothy. Jessica, I know you mentioned the benefits of having a community at university. Do you know of some resources or supports that are available to grad students in terms of building that community together?
Yeah, so there's SAGE, which is the Supporting Aboriginal Graduate Enhancement. And it's a partnership between SFU and UBC, where we have Indigenous mentors, and yes, and I want to also echo what Stevie's saying in the chat there, that Dorothy is an amazing support person for graduate students. And there's also SAGE, which they offer writing retreats, guest speakers, writing support, and normally, I'm not sure who the Indigenous faculty mentor is this year, but normally there's a faculty mentor who is Indigenous from either the UBC or SFU that provides academic support to the cohort of Indigenous students. And then every March, normally I think the past couple of years, it has been via Zoom. But every March there is the Indigenous Graduate Student Symposium, where students, graduate students, attend a conference and are hear from a keynote speaker, are able to gather and network, and then also share their current research, whether that's through presentations or poster displays. And what I loved about that was the ability to hear about what my peers were working on, and if there were opportunities for us to collaborate on things and just support each other in some of the work. I remember there was one student when I was doing my MEd who was doing research on the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. And it was amazing, some of the research that she had come across, and it was so powerful, and also could tell it was a lot of emotional labor for that student as well. And so we were able to talk about ways that she could get support and access to resources and different things like that. And I'll hand it back to Dorothy. I see her hands up.
I just want to support what Jessica is saying, how important it is to have a group. For me personally, I'm still in touch with my MA cohort, and they were individuals from all over the world in all different countries, which was amazing just to hear about what other people were doing in communications. But also during that particular program, I set up for myself a support group of Indigenous women, because, and they were all outside of the academy, but it was so important to me that I have particularly women that I could sound off, bounce things off of, in terms of being able to do the work that I was doing, and also just to have the emotional support. Because as you all know, being in a colonial, racist, white supremacist institution, we're dealing with it at every level, every day. And people don't understand that, that at every turn we're having to face it. If you're conscious and aware of your own body, and I am energy wise, so it was so useful to be able to go and meet these women once a month, just so I could feel the safety of being able to be in an Indigenous only space. And at UBC in my PhD program, I also had a cohort there that was mixed from different people from around the world, but I also had set up an Indigenous only cohort, especially when we got to our writing, because we were able to write and share chapters with each other and give feedback and give the emotional support at the same time. even though we were not in the same disciplines, but our projects were from an Indigenous perspective in whatever discipline we were in, you know. So it's like, it's so important not to isolate in your programs, because that is so the what happens in terms of your mental health being affected. I mean, I learned that really the hard way, you know, and it's like, don't be alone, reach out, you know, and especially now with COVID, it's like, it's so, just get on Zoom, do something, right? Or go for a walk with someone, you know, and do the distance thing. It's like, just don't isolate, because it affects your mental health, which in turn affects your ability to do the academic work that you need to do. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Dorothy. Go ahead, Ashley.
I just wanted to add something, and this actually has nothing to do with the question you asked us, Kaylena, but it's more about being a grad student in a virtual setting. And so I did my Master's of Library and Information Studies solely online, and that was a choice I made to around program availability and where I live in Burnaby versus commuting to UBC, and like family and work responsibilities. So I did my degree all online, and we were in a cohort, which was great, and connected through social media and a few ways like that. But it did fall apart, because I think it can be trickier to create that community online. It takes a lot of dedication. And so what I found really impactful was joining like library associations, and being involved in my community. And so as a result, I don't have necessarily a good cohort of folks who have gone through my program with, but I have an amazing circle of mostly women librarians, Indigenous librarians, that I can connect with around concerns we have, anything related to librarianship or identity, or just sort of like anything, even just to check in to see how people are doing with kids and COVID life. And so if you aren't finding that community within your cohort, I really encourage folks to look outside of the education institution to do it that way. And I just wanted to pick up one thing that Jessica was talking about with SAGE, was the library. Just this past spring has worked with the planning committee with SAGE to create a journal of publications from the Symposium, which is so exciting. And so the first issue is out, and it's all, I think it's all right now just proposals, and the second issue will come out next year with next year's conference, and we'll continue to grow it. So it was a really exciting project to be a part of, particularly with the cross-institutional relationships. So I just wanted to put a little plug. The library can help in ways that you don't quite notice as well.
Thanks, Ashley. We do have a question that came in from an attendee, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. At an institutional systems level, i.e. beyond what faculty can do to support institutional Indigenous students, what can settler of color faculty members do to work collectively towards institutional transformation of SFU's white supremacist systems for Indigenous students and peoples generally? That is, from the collective experiences and expertise of the panelists, what can faculty do to be accomplices in institutional level systems transformation, revolution? What collective actions across multiple university groups has been more or most successful, or has seen more success in your experiences, such as institutional research, protests, speaking to media? Go ahead, Jessica.
Thanks. So this question is giving me life. I am just, yes, I'm here for it. So for me, one of the things that I've been quite vocal about as a new SFU staff member and a person of color who, you know, is Black and Indigenous, is the importance of having spaces where I can connect with those who are like me. And whether that's, you know, in the institution or outside, but really at an institutional level, there needs to be an opportunity for racialized staff and faculty to gather and talk about what it means to be, you know, Indigenous, Black, or, you know, people of color in a colonial institution. And yeah, that needs to happen. So, I mean, that's one of the things that, you know, Dorothy was talking about, as well as having that circle of trust and having those people that you can talk to and not have to sugarcoat, not have to explain anything, just come with, okay, this is challenging. And you know, one of the things that I talked about with my supervisor when I first started, and I said, you know, I've started discovering that I'm comfortable being a little bit more vocal now. And, you know, there are some times when I just want to say, like, okay, you're being really white right now. I need you to just like take a step back and just hear where I'm coming from. And I just want to make sure that that's okay, because I mean it in, you know, a way that I want to kind of make it light and fun, knowing that it's not a light and fun topic. And so thankfully my supervisor took it in the way that I intended, and actually helped me to deepen our relationship and you know, talk respectfully, and made me feel really safe in bringing things up when I did feel unsafe in situations. And so I think, you know, at an institutional level, it's really important to have a space that is only for racialized people.
Thanks, Jessica. Go ahead, Dorothy.
I also really appreciate the question. And one of the things that I had done in the previous unit that I worked in was I worked with 2 South Asian women, and we put together a proposal about creating what we were calling circles of care, where Indigenous and Black and other people of colors could come together, but to meet in the within the foundations of how Indigenous peoples conduct circles, because we need to respect each other's confidentiality and all of those things, because for us to come together in those circles of care, we have to learn how to trust each other. That's one of the basics. And I think these circles of care, if they were organized and happened in a way that was mindful of all of us, then we could start to put together some fundamental strategies on how to deal with the systemic racism and the institutionalized racism, and get at the fundamental white supremacist ideology that's at the core of this colonial place that we all work in. You know, but it has to start in a mindful, careful way. So I wrote that proposal for the Center for Educational Excellence, and I was told, no, we can't do this right now. It's not important. And it got put on the shelf. That was in November 2019. And then of course in early 2020 was when George Floyd was murdered, and the whole world exploded, dealing with the institutionalized racism of all these systems that we live and work within. So I think that would be a beginning place to have circles of care. But whether, and what we had designed it for was to have it for students, staff, and faculty to work together. So not to have those kind of, the patriarchal divisions of people, that because in the circle, it's egalitarian, right? So everyone is equal. So we don't look at people's roles, or whether they have a doctor in front of their name or whatever letters people have. It's more meeting from the heart in terms of thinking about it in terms of how it affects us as human beings. So that's my suggestion. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Ashley, did you want to add anything in?
Yeah, I'll quickly add something because I have to leave right at 2 because I'm actually helping run a series that addresses this thing, right? This question, which was really exciting, called Tea and Teachings. And so that's really about what we're trying to do through Tea and Teachings is introduce these concepts to really understand at the base level first who you are in relation to the academy and who you are in relation to your discipline and why do you care about reconciliation, indigenization, and decolonization? Is it to just check off that, yes, I've been able to do this, I can tell you what those words mean? Or is it to really engage in transformative change, both for the academy, but mostly for our students? And so because we might not be able to make a lot of change right now, but our students are going to, and our children are going to, and they're the ones I think that are really going to drive change. We can support that. We're laying the foundation, but they're the ones that I think are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And so I think for us right now, and I say us as in like our generation, folks that are learning, is to recognize that you are learning and you will always be learning. And it is going to be deeply, deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. And there's going to be a lot of emotions, and that is all okay. Emotions are totally okay. And you need to start with learning how this country was really formed, how that has impacted community, how that has impacted education, and how that has maybe impacted your specific area of study. And so I've popped a link into the chat. I'm all about links and resources. It's the library side of me. I can't help it. But it's one of the pages I created for the ICRC that provides some materials, books, articles, videos around some of these topics about racism in the academy, reconciliation in the academy, allyship, all of those big topics. And I think that is a place I hope everybody starts. I'm going to backtrack it a step and be like, you also need to start by learning whose land you're on. So who was here? What were the communities called? What language was spoken? Those things before you can change big things. We need to know what the small things are. Maybe we can do that in circles of care. I would love to sit in circles with care with all of you.
Thank you. And I recognize we're almost at 2 o'clock. I just wanted to quickly say we do have some undergrads in attendance today that were wondering about the application process and what programs are available to you. I highly encourage you to reach out to any one of us and we can support you in any questions that you have. Before we close off, Dorothy, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to finish up by saying I will send the 3 of you a copy of that Circles of Care proposal so you can use it as a template to create whatever, right? So yeah. So
Beautiful.
then, yeah.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dorothy,
Thank you
Jessica, and
all.
Ashley. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Good, Jim. Thank you.